Hello, and welcome to another edition of Behind the News, our new monthly programme which goes behind the news headlines to take a closer look at the issues which affect us all, internationally, nationally and personally. Clark's with me, and later he'll be taking a look at the background to this week's American election. But first we start with a subject which we on See Here have been following with great interest for many years. Do you remember these scenes?
That's what we've got to fight for. Choices and rights in our lives. Don't want your benefits. I want dignity from where I sit.
These are deaf and disabled people campaigning vigorously in 1994-95 for a better deal, for equal rights for people like us. Did you know that there have been 27 attempts to introduce an Equality Act since the war, and 13 since 1981? A number of MPs have been working to introduce anti-discrimination legislation. First of all, there was Alf Morris, then Harry Barnes, also Jack Ashley, and finally Roger Berry. In Britain today, there are already 2 equality commissions, racial and sexual, to guarantee equality for those 2 groups of people. But until recently, there's been nothing for us. At last, we do have one. This is the British Disability Discrimination Act, passed at the end of 1995. At last, we have protection. Or do we? Unfortunately, the Disability Act does not have the same status as the Sex and Race Acts, and it's been heavily criticised for not having any teeth. Many of the disability groups have boycotted the Act. What's more, some of you may have read recently that efforts are now being made in Europe to change the Treaty of Rome, so that there would be a non-discrimination clause to stop people from being socially excluded on the grounds of disability, age or ethnic origin. But it now looks as if the British and German governments are intent on blocking the clauses. Why is it that disability equality in Britain and Europe is the subject of so much opposition? Leslie went to find out.
European disability is the theme of today's conference here in London. I'm going to be talking to 2 of our most influential deaf people in Europe and Britain. Johan Weismann, Chair of the European Disability Forum, and later I'll be talking to Doug Alker, the Chief Executive of the RNID. What do you hope to see happening in Europe?
On a European level, we have information. That's our strength. We need to work on a European level with the European Commission and the European Parliament. But what we don't have is influence on national governments. I think it's important that deaf people and other disabled people are more active in lobbying their own national governments to raise their understanding. It's important that we work together. That would be positive for everyone involved, while respecting national sovereignty. People seem to be frightened that working with Europe will mean there will be less freedom, but it will actually mean people having more freedom.
You're a member of the National Disability Council. There's been a certain amount of criticism of you for taking the post. It's also been said that the bill is rather weak and a lot of people are opposed to it. Why are you involved?
All organisations, disabled organisations and disabled people feel that the Act is not quite as good as we would have liked, but it doesn't make any sense to just oppose it. Let's say, for example, if because of the Act, employers had to provide ramps and interpreters, would people oppose that? Of course not. So most organisations and disabled people believe that we should work with the Act and at the same time continue campaigning for full civil rights. With the National Disability Council, if I wasn't involved, then somebody else would be. And that means they'd be establishing the standards, the regulations, the codes of practice, and they wouldn't be as good. So that would be a disadvantage. It's important that we have the right people involved so that we can get the maximum impact for deaf and disabled people.
Why are the government so reluctant to spend money on establishing equality for disabled people? Is it just too expensive?
Whether equality is expensive or not depends on what's considered to be reasonable. Let's say, for example, if the Act stated that everybody had to learn BSL, that would be really expensive. But on the other hand, if it said that railway stations had to provide visual indicators, then that's not expensive. So it depends on what's considered reasonable. The principle about cost. It's important to remember that equality doesn't depend on cost. If you think about equality for women, achieving that is in fact really expensive, but nobody says you shouldn't do it. It should be done. The same principle applies with disability. The cost shouldn't influence the implementation.
Do you accept that the bill is rather weak as it stands and that it doesn't have the same weight as the sexual and racial discrimination bills?
Well, I think that the Act does have a couple of problems. One being that it's not totally comprehensive, so although it covers some areas well, like employment and access, there are other areas that are not covered at all, like education. The second thing is that there's no legally recognised commission, which means the legal power is slightly dubious. But that doesn't mean we should just ignore it. Because the Act is there, it means that now the climate is beginning to change, improvements are happening, employers are looking at the Act and thinking about what they need to do and how they need to move on. So positive things are happening. We should be looking at the opportunities that are out there for deaf people and disabled people to be working with employers to improve things, and the situation is better now than it's ever been before. Deaf people do have rights, that's a fact, but you also can't ignore the fact that employers need to make a profit. That's important too. So both these things need to be happening at the same time. So it's about how employers can make a profit and also provide access for deaf people. That's what we're working towards. And I think we're getting there.
Hope we've managed to clear up some of your questions about the Disability Act. In Britain it comes into force on the 2nd of December. We will be looking at some of the details of the Act in See Here programmes starting in a few weeks' time, when we look at the provisions for employment. And now we're going to take a look at a world event which only happens once every 4 years, but its result will affect us all into the next century: the American presidential election. Clark's been taking a closer look at what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic.
This week, a nation goes to the polls to decide who should fill the vacancy for the most powerful job in the world, the President of the United States of America. There are two main candidates in the race for the position: Bob Dole, who represents the Republican Party, and the man currently holding down the job as President, Bill Clinton, from the Democratic Party. The winner will be the leader of the strongest and richest nation in the world, and he will have the responsibility of steering America into the 21st century. The job lasts for 4 years, and the decisions the President makes during that time will shape the kind of world that we live in. So when the citizens of the US make their decision this week, we will be affected by the result, whether we like it or not. The American people will be casting their vote in a huge country. You could fit Britain into it 25 times over and still have room to spare. Its sheer size is the key to the amazing variety of its people and why parts of the United States look so very different from each other. Today there are more than 260 million Americans, one of the largest populations on Earth.
president was George Washington, who was the hero of the War of Independence when the American colonies broke away from British rule in 1776. There were no proper political parties at the time, and indeed Washington himself hated the very idea of political parties. But it was inevitable in a free society that groups would get together to try and gain control of government, in particular the presidency. Out of the number of political parties that sprang up, there are two which have always been successful: the Republicans and the Democrats. It's quite difficult to make comparisons between the political parties in America and those in this country. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have their liberals, their moderates, and their right-wingers. But the Democratic Party has many similarities to the British Labour Party, while the Republican Party is a bit more like our Conservative Party. Famous Democrat presidents over the years have included John F. Kennedy and Franklin D. Roosevelt, and of course Bill Clinton. While on the Republican side, their famous presidents have included Abraham Lincoln, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. So let's take a look at the main candidates for the next President of the United States.
Over the last 4 years, America's president has been a Democratic one, Bill Clinton. He's a confident president, determined to lead his party and his country into the 21st century.
This must be a campaign of ideas, not a campaign of insults. The American people deserve it. But with all respect, we do not need to build a bridge to the past. We need to build a bridge to the future, and that is what I commit to you to do.
But his 4 years in office have been marked by a series of scandals and disasters, and his chances of winning a second term as president were almost written off a year or two ago. He has cleverly rebuilt his image, portraying himself as a moderate man, protecting the nation against the dangers of the extreme elements of the Republican Party.
The only question is what to do. I could never allow cuts that devastate education for our children, that pollute our environment, that end the guarantee of health care for those who are served under Medicaid, that end our duty or violate our duty to our parents through Medicare. I just couldn't do that.
He's intelligent, articulate, and charismatic. Most Americans seem to believe that he has the right qualities to be president.
After these 4 good, hard years, I still believe in a place called hope, a place called America.
The Republican Party has chosen Bob Dole as their candidate. Wounded in the Second World War, the 73-year-old has shown many fighting qualities over the years. He'll need them all in the next few days, because he's trailing Bill Clinton very badly in the opinion polls.
My father was poor, and I love my father. Do you imagine for 1 minute that as I sign the bills that will set the economy free, I will not be faithful to Americans in need? You can be certain that I will, for to do otherwise would be to betray those whom I love and honor most, and I will betray nothing. And this perspective...
He's tried to woo America with an offer of a 15% cut in income tax, but it doesn't seem to have worked. In some states, the more he has campaigned, the more his opinion poll ratings have sunk. Many Republicans fear that Bob Dole is heading for a landslide defeat and that he may drag the entire party down with him. This could result in the Republicans losing control of the US Congress, which for them would be an election disaster.
Tonight I stand before you, tested by adversity, made sensitive by hardship, a fighter by principle, and the most optimistic man in America.
With his running mate Jack Kemp, he still dreams of unseating Bill Clinton and taking his place in the White House.
So what actually happens on election day? Is it similar to our elections in this country? Well, the business of voting in the USA is much more complicated than our system of simply putting a cross against one name in a list of candidates. To understand the way the president is actually elected, it's best to see the election not as a nationwide contest, but as one that takes place, first of all, in each of the 50 individual states. Whoever wins in each state gets not one, but a number of what are called electoral college votes, which count towards winning the presidency. Each state gets so many votes according to the size of its population. Take 3 of the largest states, for instance. California gets 54 votes, Illinois 22, and Texas 32 votes. If Clinton or Dole wins all 3, that means he's already got 108 votes and is well on the way to the magic figure of 270, which wins him a majority and a place in the White House for the next 4 years. So on election day, it's as well to look out for the way the big states go, because with all the electoral college votes they carry, they are crucial to the final result. Not surprisingly, the candidates concentrate the bulk of their time, money and resources on the states that get a large number of electoral votes. And most of that effort goes on one thing: television.
The biggest weapon used by the candidates in their race for the most powerful job in the world is their use of the most powerful medium in the world. The parties know that most voters get their news and their opinions from television. Beautifully staged managed displays of enthusiasm by loyal supporters are put on at the party conventions simply for the benefit of the prime-time TV audience. Bill Clinton used the Democratic Convention to put across his vision of the future to the American public watching at home.
I love and revere the rich and proud history of America, and I am determined to take our best traditions into the future.
Speeches are very short and often very moving. In an attempt to win over the women voters of America, the Republican convention brought on their star performer, Elizabeth Dole.
Tonight I'd like to break with tradition for 2 reasons. One, I'm going to be speaking to friends, and secondly, I'm going to be speaking about the man I love.
She told a personal story about her husband who was watching events on TV in his hotel room.
One morning, unbeknownst to me, he left his bedroom and went down where Mother was fixing breakfast in the kitchen. And he had a towel over his arm and shoulder that had been disabled in the war. And he said, "Mrs. Hanford, I think you ought to see my problem." Mother said, "Bob, that is not a problem. It's a badge of honor."
She spoke about Bob Dole's charity work for other disabled people.
Tim, I want to thank you for your courage and your spirit. Thank you, Tim, for inspiring Bob Dole to start the Dole Foundation for People with Disabilities. We love you. Thank you.
Many of the delegates travelled thousands of miles across America to be at the conventions. To them, politics is a serious business, but there's always room for a bit of fun.
Probably the most nerve-wracking time for the candidates takes place during the TV debates, which are watched by over 100 million American viewers, not to mention countless others around the world. So they can't afford to make any mistakes which might seriously affect their prospects of being elected. As a result, the exchanges can become a little heated, especially during the final TV debate, where the issue of Mr. Clinton's character came up.
In front of an audience of ordinary voters in California, it was perhaps Bob Dole's last big chance before the election to take a swing at President Clinton's character, and this he did from the very first question.
The views have been distorted. Many American people have lost their faith in government. They see scandals almost on a daily basis. They see ethical problems in the White House today. They see 900 FBI files, private person being gathered up by somebody in the White House. Nobody knows who hired this man. So there's a great deal of cynicism out there. also a public trust. When you're the President of the United States, you have a public trust. And you have to keep that public trust, as George Washington, as Abraham Lincoln did. And I think now that trust is being violated. It seems to me we ought to face up to it.
Mr. Clinton mostly ignored the attacks, choosing to act presidentially by suggesting that the sleaze issue was rather beneath him.
I don't want to respond in kind to all these things. I could answer a lot of these things tit for tat. But I hope we can talk about what we're going to do in the future. No attack ever created a job or educated a child or helped a family make ends meet. No insult ever cleaned up a toxic waste dump or helped an elderly person.
Okay, my question is...
One personal matter did come up from the audience. Is Bob Dole too old for the presidency?
Well, I think age is very, wisdom comes from age, experience, and intelligence. And if you have some of each, and I have some age, some experience, some intelligence, that adds up to wisdom.
I can only tell you that I don't think Senator Dole is too old to be president. It's the age of his ideas that I question.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. President. Vice President today.
At the end, a poll of viewers showed that President Clinton had won the contest convincingly. But the big question remains, will he win the big one? Well, after all the razzmatazz, the media hype, and the long, exhausting campaign, in the end, it's the American voters who decide. We here in Britain can only stand in the wings and watch with interest. We won't know the results until the early hours of Wednesday morning. The BBC will be covering it from 11:45 at night, unfortunately without subtitles. But if you haven't watched it before, it's well worth having a look.
And now finally to a story which has been described as one of the last scandals of World War II, still to be resolved. In the last few weeks, details have come to light of vast amounts of gold looted by the Nazis during the 1930s and 40s and locked up in the vaults of Swiss banks. Latest estimates suggest that the highly secretive Swiss banking system holds around £4.6 billion of Nazi gold at today's prices, looted not only from the central banks by the Germans across occupied Europe, but also gold, jewellery and property from organisations and individuals, the Jewish community in particular. Survivors of the Holocaust and relatives of victims are demanding that assets are handed back. According to the Foreign Office, the Nazis took $400 million out of Belgium, Holland and Austria alone. The money passed through Germany to Switzerland, where it was held in more than 700 separate accounts. After the war, the Swiss agreed to hand over the $60 million into the banks of Britain, France and America, but Jewish survivors and their families were not compensated. Embarrassed by all the criticisms, the Swiss banks have promised to give a team of investigators access to their archives and bank files. Progress is expected to be painfully slow, perhaps taking up to 3 years. But time is running out for the ageing survivors, and many questions have still to be answered. With me in the studio to talk about the background to the issue of the missing millions is Eva Fielding Jackson. Hello. Can you explain a little bit about what your family went through during the Second World War?
My father, I'll start with my father. He was one of 4 brothers who all went with their parents to labour camps where they all died of starvation or whatever. My father was the sole survivor, the only one. This is him. Then there was my mother's family, where there were 10 brothers and sisters, and her mother and father. Her father was a rabbi. I'll say more about that later. All the family were sent to Auschwitz. My mother was at boarding school because she was deaf, and although she had a deaf brother, she was the only one to be at boarding school. And because she was at school, she survived. She was the sole survivor. The rest of her family was sent there. I have proof of that. This is a list of the names, addresses and dates of birth of all the brothers and sisters who, on the 15th of June 1944, were sent to Auschwitz.
My grandfather, their father, who was a rabbi, owned his own jeweller's shop, which was later taken, but the family have no evidence of what happened to it.
I understand that just recently it's come to light that this money is in Swiss bank accounts. How do you feel about that?
Well, really, when I read about it, it didn't have that much of an impact on me, because I already knew about it beforehand. You know the film Schindler's List? I've seen that 7 times, and that had a greater impact on me and upset me. It showed how people's family photographs were gathered up into heaps, their jewellery and teeth were all just piled up. That hit me. It reminded me of my mother's stories, but at the time I really didn't take too much notice. But when I saw the film, it brought it all to life for me, and it was very painful.
I understand that it's been announced that survivors will be paid compensation, but that this could take up to 3 years. Do you think that's right? How do you feel about it?
I'm not happy about it. It's okay for me, I'm young, but there are a lot of older people who have lost their gold. Not just Jewish people, but others too. They are old and don't have much longer to live. This all happened 50 years ago. Half of them haven't married or had children because of the shock of what happened to them during the war. They can't wait 3 years.
Can you tell me what you'd like to see happen in the future?
I know it's a difficult situation without the evidence. I don't have any proof of what my parents have told me, but there are lots of stories out there that are not backed up with evidence. These people have died and there is no evidence anymore. I think what should happen is that those people who do have evidence to support their claim should be compensated, and what's left should be shared amongst those who don't. I'm not sure how you'd calculate the amounts, depending on how many people died or how you verify the claims. You can only rely on what people tell you, and that opens it up to people who don't have a legitimate claim, saying that they do. It's difficult, I know. I've got some evidence like that. My family have died, and I've been consistently told about the family gold. There are other people in the same situation. It should be shared out equally. We need to get together, brainstorm the issue, and find a way.
Thank you. Well, that's all for this month. Meanwhile, if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in the world, don't forget to watch the Interpreted Breakfast News every weekday morning at 7:15. We'll be back in a month's time with another edition of Behind the News. Until then, goodbye.